Okay, I had to find one slide before I click this. Okay, Noah's flood washing away millions of years. How many of you have ever been to the Grand Canyon? Okay, a good number of you. I've been there many times. I've been about, 18 trips down the Colorado River now to go through the Grand Canyon. This summer will be, Lord willing, our 13th trip, taking theologians and Bible scholars down the river for 7 days. We invite old earth creationists, young earth creationists, people who are sitting on the fence, not sure what to think about the age of the earth. And we have 2 geologists, an Old Testament professor, and myself, and we teach them morning and evening and during the day on the raft, and we teach them geology and history and the Bible, and try to strengthen the young earthers and convince the old earthers to give up the millions of years. But when you go up to the rim and you look at those layers, you can't help but ask the question, especially the first time, when and how was all this formed? And how did the canyon form? How did the layers form? And there are fossils in those layers. How did those form? And as we saw, the evolutionists say that fossil record from the first living cell is about 3.5 billion years. From the macroscopic bottom-dwelling sea creatures that exploded on the scene about 550 million years ago, most of the life was in the last about 550 million years. But as we saw, a lot of Christians today have accepted that idea. And I have found in my reading and in my discussions with theologians or lay people or students that most Christians who are trying to accept the millions of years only look at Genesis 1, and usually pretty superficially. They don't think about Noah's flood. But the flood is critical to the question of the age of the earth. And so I want to look at it briefly, biblically, and then geologically. Now, in the history of the church, there have been 4 views of the flood, and we looked at this already a little bit, but just to review, the first 18 centuries, the almost universal belief of the church was that Noah's flood was a historical, global catastrophe. It really happened in history when the water reached the highest level, which wasn't on the first day. It covered the whole planet, and it was a catastrophe of unimaginable destructive power. But in the early 19th century, men who accepted the millions of years began to advocate that it was a historical local flood or a historical global peaceful flood, and the liberals said it was a myth. And I could give a whole lecture just on the fact that it was a historical event. Biblical and extra-biblical evidence supports that conclusion. But I want to just focus on the fact that it was a global catastrophe. And we'll just look at a few of the biblical reasons for that conclusion. First of all, the purpose of the flood. It's really important to pay attention to the details of the biblical text. God did not send the flood to destroy sinful man. The Bible is very clear about this. He says in Genesis 6, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast and creeping thing and the birds of the air. And verse 13, behold, I will destroy them with the earth. So the purpose of the flood was not to destroy sinful man, but to destroy sinful man and all the land animals, all the birds, and the surface of the earth itself. And only a global flood would accomplish that objective. The birds, interestingly, are mentioned, I believe, over 10 times in the flood account. God wants us to know the birds were saved in the ark. The birds that weren't in the ark, they perished. That's important. Because if the flood was local, the birds just fly out of the flood zone. They don't need to go into an ark. And the animals don't need to go in an ark. The ones outside the flood zone don't need to worry about it. Animals in North America, South America, Africa, Europe, Russia, China, Australia, they could care less if there's a flood in the Middle East. Only a global flood accomplishes the purpose. And that leads right on to the purpose of the ark. And the purpose of the ark was not to save a few animals so Noah could start a farm after the flood. The purpose is very clearly stated in Genesis 7. Take 2 of every kind of unclean animal, 7 pairs of the clean animals and birds, to keep the species, or really offspring, alive on the face of the earth. That's not really a good translation there, because species has a biological connotation that the Hebrew word there doesn't have. But it was to keep animals alive so that they could reproduce after the flood. But as soon as we mention the ark, people scoff. Non-Christians, of course, scoff, but sadly some Christians scoff, and they say, well, there's no way you could fit all the animals in that ark. Well, you couldn't fit the animals in that ark, but that wasn't the ark. So we need to get that idea out of our heads. We also need to get it out of the heads of our children. And I don't want to offend anybody, and I haven't been over to the children's area here in the church, but we also need to get it out of our Sunday school classrooms, because that wasn't the ark. And we should stop buying the books that teach children that silly ark, because there's a lot of books about the ark that looks like it's a floating bathtub. Quite a few books that teach the children that it's a floating bathtub. But the Bible gives us the dimensions. And it was 1.5 football fields long, a half a football field wide, and 4 stories tall. So we need from the earliest age to give the kids that understanding of the ark. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us the shape exactly, except for the dimensions. That's our imagination. That's not infallible. In the history of art about the flood, it's often been pictured as a barge. Creation scientists and other researchers have done experiments with models in the laboratory, and engineers tell us that it's very difficult to make a square corner out of wood and have it be strong. But that particular design also just naturally causes the boat to turn sideways to the waves. And so, as a result of research on ancient ships and experiments, that's the way we've designed it, our ark, at the Ark Encounter. And it had 3 decks, the Bible says. And so we can calculate the volume capacity of the ark, and it was equivalent to about 450 18-wheeler trucks, which was enormous. And if you come to our ark, you'll see how big that was. And we've had non-Christian journalists come in the early days when the ark was even not completed. And some of them walked into the ark and said, wow, I see how you could fit all those animals in this. This is huge. Well, we've tried to calculate how many animals went into the ark. And the Bible doesn't say that he took species. It says he took kinds, 2 of every kind. And we think from creation researchers studying breeding experiments and observations in the wild that have been reported in the scientific literature, we think that in most cases the created kind is at the classification level of family in the taxonomic classification system. Species, genus, family. And so we think that there were probably about 1,400 kinds of land animals and birds, and about 7,000 animals. Average size, probably the size of a sheep, but lots of creatures, especially the birds, much smaller than that. There was plenty of room in the ark for the animals and for all the plant material that they had to take for food. Then there's the character of the flood. Of course, it had to be violent if it was going to destroy the earth, but there's a couple of verses that bring this out very clearly. We have time to only look at one, and that's in Genesis 7:11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, and the 17th day of the month. Now, right there, you know you're reading history. It doesn't say, once upon a time in a land far away. It's giving us the year, the month, and the day of Noah's life. On that same day, all the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the floodgates of the sky were open. So, 2 sources for the water. You ask the average Christian, where'd the water come from? They said, well, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. Well, it did. That's what the next verse says. But it rained longer than that because the Bible says that God didn't close the floodgates of the sky till the 150th day. And that alone would be catastrophic, because this was not a gentle rain to water the garden. This was the wrath of God poured out against a sinful world. And if there was any slope to the land, the soil would quickly become supersaturated with water, and you would have mudslides that make the mudslides in Southern California every year look like a Sunday school picnic on a sunny day. But that probably wasn't the primary source of water, because it's not mentioned first here in Genesis 7:11, and it's not mentioned first in chapter 8, verse 2, when God closed the fountains of the deep and closed the floodgates of the sky. Now, in the Bible, in the Old Testament, the great deep usually refers to the oceans. So these are fountains coming into the ocean, and the word fountains implies it's coming under high pressure, and since it's coming from in the earth, it's reasonable to assume high temperature. And then we have two words. Burst open is a translation of one Hebrew word. It's an interesting word. It's used a few other times in the Old Testament. It's used in the book of Numbers when Korah rebels against the leadership of Moses, and God tells the children of Israel to move away from Korah and his tents and his livestock. And the Bible says the ground opened. It's the same word. And their tents and their livestock and their family went into the earth. It was a small earthquake. Same word is used in Zechariah 14, verse 4, talking about the second coming of the Messiah, Jesus, and it says his feet will touch the Mount of Olives east of Jerusalem, and the mountain will split in two, and a huge valley will form. So that one word is loaded with geological significance, because it's telling us that at the beginning of the flood, and for the next 150 days, the crust of the earth was breaking apart in many places. And if you have an earthquake on the ocean floor or on the land, you often produce volcanoes. And if you have an earthquake or a volcano on the ocean floor, what are you going to produce? You're going to produce tsunamis. And we know what that tsunami in Japan did a few years ago. It was just devastating. And you can go on YouTube and watch as a helicopter is flying over the coast of Japan, watching that water just roll across the land, and it's destroying everything in its path. So anything not in the ark would perish. Creatures which could run to higher ground would, but sooner or later there would be no higher ground, and they would be swept away by those floodwaters. Then there's the height of the flood. The Bible is crystal clear in Genesis chapter 7. The waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed 15 cubits, or about 25 feet, and the mountains were covered. Now, water always seeks a level plain. So if you're going to cover mountains, you got to pour a lot of water, because the water's going to go downhill until it gets to where it can't go any farther. To believe in a flood that was just in the Middle East, that covered just the mountains in the Middle East, you'd have to believe in a flood like that. But you've never seen a flood like that. God would have had to supernaturally put his hands around the Middle East and block every single mountain pass. But there's nothing in the biblical text that said that God was trying to contain the waters of the flood. That idea is both illogical and unbiblical. The final biblical evidence that I want to mention is the rainbow promise. In Genesis 9, God promises that never again will he send a flood. And he gave the promise to Noah and all of his descendants, to the animals and all their offspring, to the birds and all their offspring, and he made the promise to the earth itself. And he repeats the promise several times in about 10 verses, just so we know what he was saying. If the flood was local in the Middle East, God lied, because there have been many local floods that have destroyed some people, some animals, some birds, and some of the earth. Only a global flood fits the rainbow promise. Now, what would we expect to find from a global flood that, according to Genesis, lasted 371 days from the start of the flood until they came out of the ark? and was designed to destroy all the land animals, birds, and people not in the ark, and by implication would have ripped up all the vegetation on the land and destroyed lots of sea creatures. As the fountains of the deep broke open, any creatures near any volcanic eruption are going to be immediately killed. And as the waves crash onto the land, they're going to bring sea creatures, especially bottom-dwelling sea creatures, up onto the land, bury them in sediments. Well, we would expect to find from that event billions of dead things buried in rock layers that were once soft sediments of sand, silt, clay, mud. We'd expect to find evidence that those sediments were deposited by water and not in a desert. And we'd expect to find the evidence all over the earth. And that's exactly what we find. We find marine fossils on the tops of all of our highest mountains, even the Himalayas. How did they get there? They weren't washed up there. Those mountain ranges were once all horizontal layers. They have been broken and buckled and bent. Well, that fossil record is a record of death and pain. We can see evidence from the fossils that some creatures were buried alive. We see evidence of killing. There are creatures fossilized in the stomachs of other creatures. We see evidence of disease and thorns and extinction. And for the last 200 years, the scientific majority has told us that's evidence of millions of years. But really, most of it is the testimony to Noah's flood. And so we want to turn to some of the geological evidence for this flood. And as we said, at the middle of the 19th century, by about 1840, the uniformitarian view became the ruling view in geology. That's also about the time that geology became a degree at the university. Prior to that, geologists were geologists who were self-taught. Lyell, Hutton, they were self-taught. They didn't go to the university to get a degree in geology. And 1840 or so was about the time that geology became a paid profession. Before that, geology was done by men who were independently wealthy. And so all the universities that had geology departments springing up, all the geology journals, the geological societies, they were all controlled by this uniformitarian view. Until about the 1970s, when something very unexpected happened. Some evolutionary geologists began to reject that uniformitarian view and go back to the views of the early 19th century catastrophists. And I want to mention one of the men who was influential in that thinking. His name was Derek Eger. He was a famous British geologist. He was a professor of geology and head of the department at University College Swansea in Wales. He was one-time president of the British Geologists Association. He wrote 4 books on geology, 200 technical papers on geology. He visited over 50 countries of the world studying geological formations. And in the last book that he wrote, which was published just after he died, in the preface, in bold font, he warned people like me, creationists, from using anything in his books to support our view. But he's dead now, so I do it all the time. Because what he said is very revealing and true. I'm quoting from one of his earlier books, The Nature of the Stratigraphic Record. He's writing to his fellow evolutionary geologists, and he's talking about the strata, the rock layers that have fossils in them. And he's got a short chapter on the history of geology, and he's looking back at the early 19th century. And I want you to listen to what he says, and then I'll illustrate. He says, my excuse for this lengthy and amateur digression into history is that I've been trying to show how I think geology got into the hands of the theoreticians, in his mind, in the context, those were the uniformitarians of the early 19th century, who were conditioned by the social and political history of their day more than by observations in the field. He said, they were more controlled by social and political ideas in their heads than by what they observed in the rocks. He goes on, in other words, we have allowed ourselves to be, what's that word? Brainwashed. That's not my word, that's his word. Brainwashed into avoiding any interpretation of the past that involves extreme and what might be termed catastrophic processes. What's he saying? He's saying to his fellow evolutionists, look, when we went to high school, we took our geology class, and our teachers taught us slow, gradual processes will explain everything you see. We went off to the university and decided to major in geology, and our professors taught us slow, gradual processes will explain everything you see. We went off and got our PhDs. We were taught to think like uniformitarians. That's the way he was taught. And then he went out into the world, and he went to all those different countries, and the more he looked at rocks, the more he saw evidence of catastrophe. And the last book he wrote was entitled The New Catastrophism. And I'm going to quote from that in a minute, but first I want to illustrate brainwashing, and I have a pop quiz. It's a one-question exam. It won't go on your transcript, so don't worry about that. But it's multiple choice. So here's the question. Here you have two curved yellow lines. And the question is, what's missing? What was that picture originally? Was it A? Was it B? Was it C? Or was it D? How many think it was A? B? C? D? How many of you are afraid to answer the question? Bunch of cowards. Well, we'll grade the exam right now, and the correct answer is nothing is missing. It was drawn that way. Now, why did you think something was missing? Well, you thought, well, he wouldn't ask what's missing if something's not missing, so I've got to figure out what's missing and put it into the picture. I controlled the way you thought about those two curved yellow lines just by putting a question into your head. Dr. Eger said, we were brainwashed, so we couldn't see any evidence of catastrophe. He eventually did, but from his writings, I would venture to guess he probably died as an atheist. He saw evidence of catastrophe, but he never saw the evidence for one big catastrophe, Noah's flood. But in the last book he wrote, The New Catastrophism, he had a whole bunch of examples of geological formations that have traditionally been interpreted as forming over millions of years, and he concluded from his observations and research that they were formed in minutes, hours, days, or weeks. One of the examples in his book is the Sutton Stone. It's a conglomerate near his home in Wales. And a conglomerate is a rock layer that's made up of lots of pebbles and boulders, pretty small. And as you can see, they're rounded. All the sharp edges and corners have been rounded off, and that's because this rock material was ripped up from somewhere else and transported, and in the process of being transported, it just ground off all the sharp edges and corners, and then it got re-cemented together in a new location. He said this has usually been interpreted as the basal conglomerate of a diachronous transgressive sea. It has been suggested with very little fossil evidence that this conglomerate spans 3 to 5 ammonite zones, those are shell creatures in the ocean, and therefore up to 5 million years in time. Very little fossil evidence, but the standard theory is 5 million years. But he studied it and concluded, I think it was deposited in a matter of hours or minutes. Wow, that's a big change in interpretation. Millions of years versus hours or minutes. What changed? The rocks didn't change. His interpretation changed because he had become open to catastrophe as an explanation for what he was looking at. So again, as I emphasized, everybody has the same rocks and fossils. You start with anti-biblical assumptions, you won't see any evidence for a young earth or global flood. But if you start with biblical assumptions, you put on biblical glasses, the rocks are screaming a young earth and global flood. So we're going to put on biblical glasses and see what we see. How long does it take to make fossils? Well, the first thing you need to know is that when they dig up a fossil, it doesn't have a label on it saying how old it is. In fact, they don't date the fossils. They don't even date the layers that the fossils are in, because those are sedimentary layers. They usually date volcanic layers, ash beds, volcanic lava flows. And they get a lava flow here and an ash bed down here, and they get a radiometric date on those two, and that sandwiches the sedimentary rock in between, and so then they get an approximate date. But here's an interesting statement about fossilization in a book on dinosaurs by two evolutionists. Fossilization is a process that can take anything from a few hours to millions of years. Now stop and think about that sentence. How do they know it takes millions of years for a fossil to form? Has there ever been a geologist who's watched a bone turn into stone over millions of years? No. Could you get a whole group of geologists to overlap their scientific careers? So one guy watched this bone for his whole scientific career, took notes, then he passed on his notebook to the next one, and she watched it for her whole scientific career, passed on her notes, and they could say, well, collectively, we've observed this. No, geology's only been a science for about 200 years, so how do they know it takes millions of years? It's not observational science, it's an assumption. How do they know it happens in a few hours? Now we are talking observational science. They go on to say, the amount of time that it takes for a bone to become completely permineralized is highly variable. If the groundwater is heavily laden with minerals in solution, the process can happen rapidly. Modern bones that fall into mineral springs can become permineralized within a matter of, what's that word? Weeks. Not months, not years, not centuries, not millennia, not millions of years, weeks. What do you have to have for this to happen? Well, they tell us, groundwater heavily laden with minerals in solution. Can you think of any event in the Bible where you might have a lot of groundwater heavily laden with minerals in solution? Yeah, Noah's flood, the fountains of the great deep. We have fountains on the ocean floor today that are full of minerals. And as you have waves crashing onto the land, pulverizing rock, you're going to have all kinds of minerals in solution. And the flood didn't happen a few weeks ago. It's 4,500 years ago. But the fossils themselves speak of rapid burial and fossilization. In Kentucky, we have deer hunting all year long. There are a few weeks when you can hunt with a bow or a gun. But then the rest of the year, people hunt with their car. And I've noticed a strange thing in Kentucky. When they kill the deer with a bow or a gun, they take it home and process it and put it in the refrigerator. When they kill it with the car, they leave it on the side of the road. And so as a result, we've got a lot of fossils all over the freeways and highways of Kentucky. No, it's not like that in Kentucky. Why? Because if the highway department doesn't come and pick that up, it's only a matter of time before scavengers, micro-decay organisms eat all the evidence. So to make a fossil, you've got to bury the creature rapidly, cut it off from scavengers, micro-decay organisms, and turn it into stone. And the fossils are screaming, rapid burial and fossilization. Here's an ichthyosaur caught in the act of giving birth. Mom and baby were swimming along. The baby wasn't completely out when they got hit with a wave of sediment-choked wave of water, buried alive, and before scavengers, microorganisms, and oxygen in the water could eat everything, they were turned to stone. This fish didn't get to finish swallowing his lunch. These two turtles were buried in the act of mating. This school of fish didn't know what hit them. These trilobites were stopped dead in their tracks. This is an ammonite fossil, beautifully preserved. The feathers of this bird are beautifully preserved. Here's an amazing preservation of an insect. Here's a wasp. Charles Darwin said, no organism wholly soft can be preserved in the fossil record. Well, Charlie was wrong about a lot of things. He was wrong about this. I've got proof. Here is coprolite, which is fossilized animal manure. Now that had to be fossilized pretty quickly. And there are scientists who study that stuff to figure out what the creature ate for its last meal. Here's a fossilized worm found in China. They have found fossilized jellyfish. And they have found now dinosaur bones that have soft tissue and blood cells in them. That shouldn't be there if those bones are millions of years old. In fact, Dr. Brian Thomas at the Institute for Creation Research has made it a major ongoing project of his to catalog published research in the secular scientific literature documenting soft tissue all the way through the geological column, all the way down to the Cambrian explosion. None of that should be there if it's millions of years old. It had to have been buried rapidly. And if the fossils formed quickly, then that means that the rock layers that the fossils are in formed and hardened rapidly. Well, how long does it take to form and erode a rock, even if they don't have fossils? When I was working on my PhD, I came across some research on the east coast of England. Magic in the marsh, the newspaper reported. Without any regard to the laws of geology, mud on the marsh is hardening into stone in a few years rather than the thousands it usually takes. Now stop and think again. How do they know it usually takes thousands of years for rock to form? And the answer is, they don't. That's not an observation. That's an assumption. How do they know it happens in a few years? Now we're talking observational science. Professor Coleman, the geologist working on this, said the rock was forming faster than anybody had ever believed possible. See what the problem was? Their belief system. I wasn't surprised when I read this, but they were surprised. With one stone creating itself in just 6 months, they often contain beautifully preserved fossils where the detail of the soft flesh of the creature is caught as well as the bone, as it had no time to rot before the rock formed around it. What was happening here? Well, they studied the mud under the microscope, and they found that there were bacteria in the mud that were eating things in the mud and producing a waste product that was the cementing agent to turn the mud into stone. So all you need is the right chemicals in solution, and you can make rock really quickly. And you know this. It doesn't take millions of years to make a freeway. And what's a freeway made out of? Concrete, man-made rock. What about erosion? The Scablands in eastern Washington is a beautiful area of 15,000 square miles of rolling hills and valleys cut into solid basalt, a massive lava deposit. And for decades, the scientific community and the tourist agencies said this area was carved slowly, just a particle at a time, over millions and millions of years. But you can go even to evolutionary websites that say that most of this was carved in 1 to 2 days by floodwaters in solid rock. And the area we're talking about is out there in eastern Washington state. And there was a geologist out there in the 1920s by the name of J. Harlan Bretz. And as he walked in that area and studied it carefully, he was an evolutionist, he believed in millions of years, but he concluded that it was eroded catastrophically. He didn't know where the water came from for sure. He speculated that it came from the north. But he published his first article in 1923 about this catastrophic flood. And when it hit the press, the scientific community went ballistic. They called him names. They said it was an outrageous hypothesis, but he was a thick-skinned guy, and he continued to do research. A few years later, another geologist was working in Montana, and he said, I think I've found the water for that flood. The water's not there anymore, but there's evidence that there was a lake there, which they call Lake Missoula in western Montana. And he proposed the theory that at the end of the last ice age, what evolutionists say is the last of many ice ages over hundreds of thousands of years, what creationists say was the only ice age, which was caused by the flood, after the flood. At the end of the Ice Age, as the ice was melting and receding back into Canada, there was an ice dam in a narrow valley at the western end, and that dam gave way, and that whole lake drained through the scablands with water moving at an estimated 60 to 100 miles an hour, carrying boulders the size of houses or small automobiles, scouring that landscape. Well, it was a few more years before the scientific establishment agreed with Bretz, and before he died, he received the Geological Society of America's highest award for his research. But Dr. Stephen Jay Gould tells the story of this change in perspective, and he says, the establishment, as represented by the United States Geological Society, closed ranks in opposition to Bretz. Instead of testing Brett's flood on its own merits, they rejected it on general principles. What were the general principles? Uniformitarianism. Brett's, you can't be right, because everything must be explained by slow, gradual processes. Brett stood against a firm, highly restrictive dogma that never had made any sense. The emperor had been naked for a century. Charles Lyell, the godfather of geological gradualism, had pulled a fast one in establishing the doctrine of imperceptible change. Dogma, doctrine. I thought that was in religion. Oh, it is, but it's also in science. It's usually not called dogma or doctrine. It's called a paradigm or a model, and it controls the way scientists think. And it takes a brave scientist to go against the majority, because there is pressure to conform to the majority view. And so those assumptions that were controlling geology are like a pair of glasses, as we've seen. But when we put on biblical glasses, we see things that the evolutionists don't see, because they've ruled it out before they ever look at the evidence. Consider this video that's in our Creation Museum, and it features Dr. Andrew Snelling, our geologist.
Rock layers are visible in mountains, plateaus, and canyons all over the world. Where did these rock layers come from? Present processes aren't the answer. Today, sand and mud are usually deposited in thin layers along the outer edge of continents, and the formation of fossils today is rare. But somehow in the past, thick layers of sand and mud were spread across entire continents and filled with well-preserved fossils. Noah's flood suggests a way to explain these puzzling features. Flooding the continents, for example, could carry sea creatures many hundreds of feet above present sea level. Andrew Snelling is a PhD geologist from Australia who has spent over 30 years studying rocks, working in the field and in the lab.
We find marine creatures buried at the top of the Grand Canyon, which is over a mile above sea level.
A global flood could carry sand and mud enormous distances.
Some of the sand grains that are in the Navajo sandstone had to have come from the Appalachians. But what river or what process today is carrying material from the Appalachians to the southwest?
A global flood could quickly lay down thick layers of mud and sand, burying even giant animals and tall trees.
We've got coal beds with trees sitting on them, and these trees, tree stumps, go through many strata, which means that before they could rot, you had to have lots of sand and mud coming in quickly. Several places in the Grand Canyon, 4,000 feet of different types of sand and mud and lime have been bent, and they've been bent while they're still soft. Both the bottom layer and the top layer are all bent the same way, which means that the whole sequence of 4,000 feet of sand and mud and lime had to have been laid down very quickly by the waters and then bent very soon afterwards.
A global flood could form thick layers across entire continents.
In the Grand Canyon area, we've got limestone bed, the red wall limestone. The same limestone can be found over here in the eastern United States.
A global flood could cut deeply and widely.
we've got this huge flat surface at the rim of the Grand Canyon, which goes for thousands of square miles, where waters on a great scale over a vast area just swept over it and swept everything clean.
None of these processes, deep, wide erosion, or thick, rapid layering, or continent-wide distribution, or lifting of marine organisms above sea level, or sand carried across continents, occur in the present. Radically different processes are required, such as occurred during Noah's flood.
Okay, what about carbon dating and other radioisotope dating methods? Well, the first thing we need to make clear is that carbon dating is never used to date rocks, except by creationists. Because carbon dating, the maximum you can date something with carbon-14 is about 80 to 100,000 years. But the evolutionists believe the rock layers are millions of years old. And you can't date any rock unless it has carbon in it anyway. But they use other methods to date. Uranium changing into lead, potassium into argon, rubidium into strontium. But radioactive isotopes and radioactive decay was only discovered in the 1890s. That was almost a century after the geologists had already been locked into the idea of millions of years. In fact, by the end of the 19th century, the consensus was that the Earth was at least 300 million years old. So radiometric dating had nothing to do with convincing people of millions of years. The dating methods were only developed in about the 1910s. And the age of the Earth and the rock layers continually rose until about 1940. We reached the age that they now say is consensus of about 4.5 billion years. But geologists were already committed to millions of years, 100 years before all of that. Now, the dating method works in a very simple principle, like an hourglass. The sand at the top falls down to the bottom. And the sand at the top represents the parent atoms, which are isotopes. They're radioactive. They decay or change into the daughter isotopes or atoms that are in the bottom of the hourglass. So uranium changes into lead. Potassium changes into argon, etc. And so that theoretically can be used as a clock to date how long ago the rock formed. But there are problems with the methods, and they don't give accurate dates. Here's one example of the problem. Mount St. Helens was a beautiful mountain in Washington State. On May 18th, 1980, there were no boats on Spirit Lake because the geologists knew that mountain was about ready to blow its top, and it did at about 8:30 in the morning. It blew off a third of the mountaintop, and lava oozed into the crater and eventually hardened into rock. About 12 years after the volcano first erupted and everything had settled down, Dr. Stephen Austin, one of the leading creation geologists, went up on the mountain. He collected samples of that lava dome. He sent them off to a radiometric dating laboratory. He did not tell them where he got the rocks. He simply said they're recent. And they applied 4 different methods, and the results came back that these rocks are 340,000 to 2.8 million years old. But these dating methods are supposed to tell you when the lava came out of the ground and crystallized into solid rock. But we know when that happened. And those rocks were all actually less than 12 years old when they were dated. So the dating methods were wrong by just a little bit. But there are many examples in the published literature where they take these dating methods and they apply them to rocks of known age, where there were human eyewitnesses who saw the volcano erupt, and they apply the dating methods and they don't work. They give dates of hundreds of thousands or millions of years for rocks that we know are only decades or centuries old. But the evolutionists then used the methods on rocks of unknown age, where there were no human eyewitnesses, and they want us to assume that the dating methods work. But creationists object because of the assumptions in the dating methods. There are three basic assumptions for any clock to be reliable. First, you have to know what was the original ratio. If we're thinking of an hourglass, you need to know that when the hourglass was started, all the sand was in the top. If some of the sand was already in the bottom and you assume that it was all in the top, then you're going to get a much older reading for how long the clock has been running. Second, you need to know that the sand has always been flowing at a constant rate. But if this is a kitchen hourglass, and after Mom left the kitchen, your 9-year-old brother took the top off the hourglass and dropped a few drops of water in that, now the sand is kind of sticking together. It's not going to fall as fast. And then you need to know that the system is closed, that a naughty little 9-year-old didn't add sand to the top or drill a hole in the kitchen table and let some of it seep out the bottom. So you got to have a closed system. Well, the Check This Out video has a short video on radiometric dating to explain this, and so watch this.
Nearly every textbook in science magazine teaches that the Earth is billions of years old, and the primary dating method used for determining this is what is called radioisotope dating, or radiometric dating. Now, this is a reliable method for measuring absolute ages of rocks and the age of the Earth, right? First off, many scientists now regard the age of the Earth to be between 4.55 and 4.6 billion years old. Okay, so if this method is reliable and accurate, why the 50 million year discrepancy? That seems like a lot, but let's get into some details here and see what's going on. Keep in mind that there's all kinds of scientific jargon on this topic, and so we'll just present a very straightforward, simplified version of the process. Radiometric dating is the process of estimating the ages of rocks based on the decay of radioactive elements in them. Basically, there are certain kinds of atoms in nature that are unstable and spontaneously decay into other kinds of atoms. For instance, uranium will radioactively decay through a series of steps until it becomes the stable element called lead. The original element is called the parent element, and the end result is called the daughter element. Radioisotope dating is commonly used to date igneous rocks, rocks which formed when hot molten material cooled and solidified. The dating clock started when the rock cooled. During the molten state, it is assumed that the intense heat forced any gaseous daughter elements to escape. It is assumed that once the rock cooled, no more atoms escaped, and any daughter element now found in the rock is a result of radioactive decay since that rock formed. The decay rate is measured in terms of half-life, that is, the length of time it takes half of the remaining atoms of a radioactive parent element to decay. Now, of course, that can be measured in a laboratory, and it is assumed that since we know the decay rate, we can calculate backwards and come up with the age of the rock. But is that all there is to it? Here's where it gets tricky. It's true we can measure a decay rate using observational science, but there's another kind of science that is required to accurately calculate dates for rocks, and that is what we call historical science. Historical science deals with the things in the past, and therefore it cannot be repeated and tested. Dating methods require both types of science, because in order to get accurate rock dates, one would have to accurately know both the decay rate and the initial conditions of the rock sample, right? Since radioisotope dating uses both types of science, we can't directly measure the ages of rocks. There are assumptions involved. For instance, how do we know what the initial conditions were in the rock sample? How do we know the amounts of parent or daughter elements now in that sample haven't been altered by other processes in the past? How does someone know the decay rate has remained constant since the rock formed? The answer is they don't. Let's simplify here and talk about a typical hourglass. Let's say you walk into a room and you see an hourglass with sand at the top and sand at the bottom, and some sand sprinkling from the top chamber to the bottom. Well, observational science would allow us to see and measure the sand, and then calculate how long the hourglass has been running, right? We could make our sand measurements and then calculate when the hourglass was turned over, right? Well, those calculations could be wrong, because we may have failed to consider some major assumptions, like, was there any sand at the bottom when the hourglass was turned over? Has any sand been added or taken out of the hourglass? Has the sand always been falling at a constant rate? Since we did not observe the initial conditions when the hourglass started, and we haven't been watching the sand all the time since then, we must make assumptions. All three of those assumptions can affect our time calculations. Now, of course, there's more to understanding all of this, but enough said.
So, there's no good reason to trust the dating methods regarding the age of rocks. So if you go to the Grand Canyon, the national park, the park rangers will tell you it is evidence of millions of years. But really, it is the sobering testimony, those rock layers, of Noah's flood. And so I call this lecture Noah's Flood Washing Away Millions of Years, because most of those layers were deposited by Noah's flood. Some of the layers at the bottom that don't have any fossils or just microscopic fossils are pre-flood deposits, maybe formed on the third day of creation or in the years up to the flood. And some of the layers up at the top that are geographically not very extensive are from post-flood catastrophes and other processes. But most of it is the result of the flood. And so there really is no evidence for millions of years. Noah's flood washes them away. And just to be clear, we need to explain that there are Christians who believe in Noah's flood and millions of years, but they haven't thought the issue through. It's not possible to believe both of those things, because either the rock layers with all those fossils were formed before Adam, or they were formed after Adam. If they were formed before Adam, then we have to say that God looked at all those rock layers with all that death and disease and suffering and extinction, and he said, oh boy, that's very good. But if they were formed after Adam, after his sin, then the most logical cause of most of it is Noah's flood. So if we accept the millions of years, we have to logically reject Noah's flood, because you can't have a global flood that leaves no evidence. But the evolutionists say there is no evidence for a global flood. But if we believe what the Bible says about the flood, then we must reject the millions of years, because the rocks cannot be the result of Noah's flood and millions of years. It's one or the other. Well, if the evidence is so strong, why don't more geologists believe in Noah's flood and a young earth? Well, I think there are two reasons. One is in Romans chapter 1, where Paul says, because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools. We need to have a biblical view of man. The Bible says that sin darkens the mind. Ephesians 4 says the same thing. Sin darkens the mind. Sin can cause really smart people to do foolish things. Sin can cause a man to cheat on his wife and think he can get away with it. Sin can cause a business executive to think that he can embezzle money and get away with it. And sin can cause PhD scientists who are multiple times smarter than me to deny the obvious, to deny creation and the incredible design of living creatures and the evidence of catastrophe. Because if you are not prepared to bow the knee to your Creator, you cannot entertain the idea of a global flood. You might be able to entertain the idea of an intelligent designer, as long as it's not very specifically defined and not connected to the Bible. But you can't contemplate a God who brought a global flood unless you're ready to meet your Maker. That's a biblical reason why people don't see the evidence for the flood, but another reason is that of Derek Eger. We've allowed ourselves to be brainwashed. And it's not just the geologists who are brainwashed in their education system. It's not just theologians, and it's not just lay people, and it's not just brainwashing, but there's also censorship of creationist views. They don't want anybody to hear what Dr. Snelling has to say. In fact, Dr. Snelling, a few years ago, applied to the Grand Canyon National Park for a research permit. He has had other research permits over the last 20 years. This research permit was to examine 4 places in the Grand Canyon where the rock layers are bent. They're called folds. And he wanted to take samples on both sides of the fold and then samples all the way through the fold, because he believes those folds are powerful evidence that those rock layers were soft and wet when the earth moved to bend those rocks. Because there's no evidence of any breaking as you go through the bend. And the evolutionists said, well, there's no evidence as far as what you can see with your naked eye, but at the microscopic level, you'll see evidence of fracturing and changing of the minerals. Well, Dr. Snelling said, well, I want to examine that. So he applied for a permit. His permit was rejected because they said there were some more details they needed to put in. He said, okay, fair enough. He fixed his proposal, sent it back in, and he waited, and he waited. He didn't get a reply. He wrote and said, what's going on with my permit? No reply. He got I think a U.S. senator from Arizona to check with the national park. What's going on with that permit? No reply. Finally, we thought we got no choice. He contacted Alliance Defending Freedom legal organization to file a FOIA, a Freedom of Information Act request. We want to see all the email discussions, all the letters related with Dr. Snelling's application. And we got those, and it was clear viewpoint discrimination. The only reason he wasn't being given the permit was because he was a creationist. And so Dr. Snelling, with the help of this organization, filed a lawsuit against the Grand Canyon National Park, the United States Department of the Interior, to get that permit. And I think it was only about 3 weeks later that the lawyers for the Grand Canyon National Park convinced the park, you can't win this case. This is viewpoint discrimination. This is illegal. And he got his permit. And a few months later, he was in the Grand Canyon collecting his samples. He's been now, with the help of a Canadian company that specializes in cutting very thin sections of rock so that you can study them under the microscope. For the last year or so, he's been studying painstakingly in his basement with his electron microscope. He's been studying these samples, and he's just written his first very lengthy technical paper, and it's in the review process with some other creationists, and will be published soon. But why did he have to do that? If creationists are just idiots, non-scientists who don't know what they're talking about, why not let Andrew Snelling go collect rocks? He can collect all the rocks he wants. Those creationists, they're stupid. What's the problem? Why did they have to suppress his opportunity? Why did they try to block him from doing research if their position is true? Why does the ACLU threaten lawsuits against school boards or states that allow criticisms of evolution in the public school if evolution is a fact? They should welcome creationist ideas in the school, because as the teachers and the students study it, if evolution is fact, it'll be a great education experience as the students learn how to think critically and see the difference between mythology and science. If they are using legal tactics and censorship, it's proof positive to me they don't have the truth. They have to protect it. Well, it's not just the geologists and lay people, but it's also theologians. Gleason Archer, who taught Old Testament at the seminary I attended, although he was retired by the time I got there, he said, from a superficial reading of Genesis 1, the impression would seem to be that the entire creative process took place in 6 24-hour days. He didn't believe that. He believed in the day-age view until his death. If this was the true intent of the Hebrew author, a questionable deduction, as will be presently shown, and in the next pages he talks about some of his biblical arguments, one of which is too much happened on the 6th day to happen in 24 hours, which I refute in my lecture on biblical creation. But I don't believe that's the real reason. I think it's right here in the rest of the sentence. This seems to run counter to modern scientific research, which indicates that the planet Earth was created several billion years ago. Notice his words, scientific research. No, Dr. Archer, it was not the scientific research. It was the anti-biblical assumptions that were used to interpret some of the evidence from the research. So again, the geologists telling the theologians the rocks are millions of years old, and the theologians saying, okay, we'll fit it into the Bible somehow. But the issue is not science. The issue is what glasses are we wearing? And the issue for the Christian is a question of authority. Is it the inerrant word of our holy God, or is it the errant opinions of sinful men, some of whom are called geologists, who don't know everything, who make mistakes, and who are in rebellion against God, trying to explain away the world without God? And so most scientists say the earth is billions of years old, Noah's flood never happened, take my word for it. God says I created about 6,000 years ago and sent a global flood, take my word for it. We have to decide whose word we're going to take. But real science confirms what Genesis says. And increasingly, Christians are going to have to decide whether they're going to believe what God says or believe what respected evangelical theologians and Bible scholars say who have trusted what the secular geologists say. I was just informed before I started that we've got some pocket guides out there. They're normally $6, but we don't want to take them back to Kentucky, so they're just $1. And you can pick those up and give them away. And let me end by saying, if you ever go to the Grand Canyon, either to see it from the rim or from the river, I encourage you to contact canyonministries.org. They run river trips, 4-day, 7-day, and 9-day river trips. And they have half-day, full-day, and sunset tours of the South Rim with excellent guides that know the canyon and know the creationist model of the canyon, and just a great group that we enjoy working with. But let me close with this verse of Scripture. Jesus, talking about his second coming, said, "As the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away. So also will the coming of the Son of Man be." Jesus said that judgment is a warning of the judgment to come. And we will all one day stand before our Creator, who will be the judge of all the earth. And our only hope on that day is if we have put our trust in Jesus Christ in this life as our substitute to take the wrath of God for our sins. And so if you're here or if you're listening online and you have not turned from your sin, you have not repented, you have not acknowledged to God that you have sinned against Him and you deserve His judgment, and if you have not put your trust in the Lord Jesus Christ as your Savior, I urge you to do so. Because this is not just a creation evolution issue. This ultimately relates to our eternal destiny. Well, I thank you for your attention and for enduring 3 days of lectures, and pray that you will be blessed as you continue to ponder these things and use the resources that you purchased and share them with others. And God bless you and have a good evening.